On an ordinary day, on a deserted street, two white police officers decided it was the perfect moment to give an unusual welcome to a black man who had just arrived in town. They tied him to a lamppost, right in the middle of the street, as if he were an animal being restrained, a spectacle for anyone willing to watch. What they didn't know, they were messing with the wrong person, and that decision would change everything. Jason Williams had just arrived in a small town in Missouri. It was the kind of place where time seemed to have stood still, but not in a good way. Local traditions carried the weight of a racist past, kept alive by whispers in corner conversations and prejudiced glances. It was no secret that here, official rules coexisted with unwritten laws, enforced by those who considered themselves above justice, many of whom were police officers. Jason was a 40-year-old black man, towering at nearly 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a presence that commanded respect. His dark skin and serious expression stood in sharp contrast to the town's facade of false tranquility. He wasn't just any visitor. He had come to take on the role of the new police chief, but he chose to spend his first days incognito, as an ordinary citizen, to get a feel for the ground he was stepping on. During his very first walk through the town center, the reception was as cold as the winter wind. Jason strolled through the streets, observing the rhythm of the place. The suspicious and lingering stares that followed him were impossible to ignore. Outside a coffee shop, three white police officers leaning against a patrol car noticed him from afar. "Who's that over there?" "Never seen him before," remarked one of them, a burly man with a ruddy face, adjusting his belt with the air of someone in charge. "No idea, but he's in the wrong place." "Let's check him out," replied the second, frowning as he crossed his arms. The three officers approached slowly, almost deliberately, as if sizing Jason up before making their move. Jason noticed them and stopped walking. He remained calm, but he wasn't naive. He knew exactly what was about to happen. "Hey, you there," called out the group's leader, his tone leaving no room for doubt that this wasn't a friendly greeting. "What are you doing around here?" Jason turned slowly, locking eyes with the man. "Just walking, getting to know the town." "Getting to know the town, huh? Where are you from?" asked another officer, a skinny man with a thin mustache and a cynical smirk. "Kansas City," Jason replied, his voice steady and unwavering. The officers exchanged glances. Kansas City was too big, too unfamiliar for them to make sense of it. To their eyes, Jason was nothing more than an outsider. "Got any ID on you?" demanded the first officer, holding out his hand as though it wasn't a request, but an order not to be questioned. Jason pulled his wallet from his pocket and handed over his ID. The officers inspected the document, their expressions shifting to mockery as they passed it among themselves. "Jason Williams, pretty common name for someone like you, don't you think?" said the youngest officer, chuckling as he handed the ID to another. "And what exactly do you do, Mr. Williams?" asked the leader, his smile fake and dripping with sarcasm. "Tourism doesn't seem like your thing." Jason took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "Right now, I'm just observing the place. Didn't realize walking was against the law." The calm response irritated the leader. He stepped closer, reducing the space between them. "Around here, we like to know who's roaming around. And usually, guys like you don't stick around too long." Jason held his gaze steady. "And guys like me would be." The other two officers chuckled, but the leader didn't answer directly. Instead, he abruptly handed the ID back and offered a final warning. "Just watch yourself around here. This isn't a place for outsiders to stir up trouble." Jason slipped the ID into his pocket and gave a slight nod. "Thanks for the warning." As he resumed his walk, the officers stayed behind, watching him and whispering to each other, their muffled laughter following him down the street. Jason understood this encounter was only a glimpse of the toxic culture that pervaded the town. It was clear that transforming this environment would be more challenging than he had anticipated, but he was ready. What he didn't realize was how much this first conflict would shape the next steps of his mission. The next morning, Jason woke up early, as usual. His morning walks had been a long-standing habit, not just a way to stay healthy, but a time to think and observe. That day, he decided to explore streets he hadn't walked the day before, trying to learn more about the town's inner working. The early morning hours were cold and quiet, with only a few people out on the streets. Jason noticed the small details: stores with weathered signs, locals exchanging brief nods, and glances that avoided prolonged contact. The town, though seemingly welcoming on the surface, carried an undercurrent of tension that he could feel in the air. As he walked, the sound of tires rolling slowly over the pavement caught his attention. He glanced back and saw a patrol car approaching at a crawl. Jason immediately recognized the two officers he had encountered at the coffee shop the previous day. The car stopped beside him, and one of the men got out, a mocking smile plastered across his face. "Well, look who's out enjoying the fresh air," said the first officer, leaning against the car door. "Out for a jog, or are you just lost?" Jason stopped, maintaining his firm stance. "Just getting to know more of the town." The second officer got out as well, resting his hands on his belt as if bracing for confrontation. "Getting to know it, huh? Interesting. But it looks like you're wandering into the wrong parts." "The wrong parts?" Jason raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware there were restrictions on walking along public streets." "It's not about restrictions, friend," the first officer replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "It's about respecting territory. And, you know, people like you don't usually show much respect." Jason took a deep breath. He recognized the provocation but chose to respond calmly. "Maybe you should remember that, as police officers, your job is to serve the community, not to intimidate people. That kind of behavior can have consequences." The two exchanged quick glances before the second officer stepped closer, invading Jason's personal space. "Consequences? Are you threatening us, Mr. Morning Walker?" "It's not a threat," Jason said, meeting the man's gaze squarely. "It's a fact. If this kind of approach were reported, I'm certain your superiors wouldn't be pleased." The blunt tone irritated the two officers. The first one let out a dry laugh, but the second one went further. "Report us? And who do you think would believe you here, huh?" Before Jason could respond, the first officer shoved him hard against a metal pole on the sidewalk. "You know, I think you need a lesson on who's in charge around here." "That's not necessary," Jason said, trying to remain calm, though he could feel his anger rising. "Oh, I think it is," the second officer retorted. He pulled a length of rope from the patrol car's trunk, and in one swift move, they tied Jason to the pole. Jason tried to resist, but the combination of their numbers and strength made it impossible. As Jason stood bound, the two officers stepped back, laughing and making jokes. "Hey, look at that. We've got ourselves a new traffic signal," mocked the first officer, gesturing toward Jason tied to the pole. "Don't worry, buddy. We'll leave you here to reflect on how things work around here," said the second, pulling out his phone to snap pictures. Gradually, townsfolk began to gather, drawn by the scene. Some laughed openly, while others simply watched with indifferent expressions. A few recorded the incident on their phones, but no one stepped in to help. For Jason, the public humiliation was a deep wound, but he kept his expression steady, refusing to show any weakness. As the officers drove off in their patrol car, still laughing and trading taunts, Jason knew the story wasn't over. What he couldn't foresee was just how much this incident would become a turning point for that small, racist town. Jason remained tied to the pole for hours. The chill of early morning gave way to the harsh midday sun, but the indifference of the people passing by was the heaviest burden of all. Some residents glanced briefly before moving on, while others laughed outright, treating it as some kind of twisted entertainment. The streets of the small town became the stage for a scene that seemed like it belonged to a past many pretended didn't exist, but that still lingered in the mindset of that community. A group of teenagers walked by, snapping pictures with their phones and making mocking comments. "Hey man, look over here. You're famous now," shouted one of them, while another burst into laughter. Jason kept his head held high. Each laugh was a blow, but he knew he couldn't show weakness. Not here. Not to them. Among the passers-by, there were also townsfolk who clearly felt uncomfortable with what they saw, but didn't dare intervene. It was as though the fear of becoming the next target kept them locked into the role of passive spectators. An elderly woman paused briefly and whispered to her husband, "This isn't right." But he simply shook his head and pulled her along, urging her to keep walking. Meanwhile, the two officers responsible for the whole scene reappeared on the street, laughing and boasting. "Look at that, the town's never been safer," one of them said, pointing to Jason as if it were some private joke. "That's what happens when someone tries to step out of line," added the other, slapping the side of the patrol car. "They should be thanking us." Jason looked directly at them, his gaze steady and piercing through their sarcasm. "You think you've won? Justice always finds a way." For a moment, the officers' smirks faltered, but they quickly masked it with nervous laughter. "Good luck with that," one of them shot back before climbing into the car and driving away. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd of onlookers gradually thinned out. Still, the scene had already been captured on countless phones, and Jason knew those images would travel far beyond those streets. He didn't know exactly how, but he was certain the incident wouldn't end there. Eventually, a young black man approached Jason. He stopped, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "I'm going to help you out," he said in a low voice. The young man, whose name was Michael, quickly untied Jason. Once free, Jason looked at him with gratitude. "Thank you for your help, kid. I promise you, they'll pay for this." and there will be big changes in this town." Michael nodded, a hint of determination in his eyes, before disappearing down the street. Jason stood tall, brushing himself off, already formulating his next steps. What had started as an act of humiliation was about to ignite a movement the town would never forget. Behind the scenes of the town, however, another story was beginning to unfold. Footage of the incident, filled with outrage and shock, started circulating on social media. What happened next was beyond the control of those who thought they could perpetuate abuse and discrimination without consequences. The town was about to become the center of a much larger debate. The backlash didn't stay confined within the town's borders. Civil rights organizations began sharing the video, drawing attention to the case. Yet another example of structural racism and racial discrimination that persists in America. Read a tweet from a prominent NGO. The conversation was gaining momentum, and the small, forgotten town was now under the spotlight. Within the community, something started to shift. Some residents, who had remained silent until now, began openly questioning the behavior of the police officers. Small groups of neighbors gathered, sharing stories they had previously been too afraid to tell. "They did something similar to my brother last year," a woman told a friend. But no one cared. At the police department, tensions were mounting. The two officers responsible for the incident pretended to be unconcerned, but the growing buzz of criticism and the messages flooding the interim chief's phone couldn't be ignored. "We're being attacked over a joke," one of the officers defensively claimed. The tension in the air was palpable, and the officers who had caused it all had no idea what was coming. The town's new police chief was about to reveal his true identity, and when he did, there would be no room for excuses or laughter. That morning, an emergency meeting was called. The interim chief, visibly stressed, demanded the attendance of all officers, including the two responsible for the incident with Jason. They arrived unbothered, exchanging jokes as if the backlash was just another hurdle to brush aside. "This is ridiculous," one of them remarked, leaning toward the other as they walked in. "All this fuss over some guy who doesn't even belong here." As they entered the meeting room, they were met with the low hum of muffled murmurs. The other officers were seated in their chairs, their expressions ranging from curiosity to tension. Standing at the center of the room was a man commanding all attention. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, and his posture radiated authority. It was Jason. The two officers stopped midway, confused. "Who's that?" one of them whispered, but the answer came quickly. The interim chief cleared his throat and spoke in a nervous tone. "Allow me to introduce the new chief of police of Hillside, Jason Williams." Silence engulfed the room. The two officers froze, their expressions of confusion quickly shifting to panic. Jason stepped forward, locking eyes with them, his gaze as unyielding as steel. "Does the name ring a bell?" Jason asked, breaking the silence with a calm yet weighty tone. The two men didn't respond. It was as if the words had been sucked out of their mouths. Jason walked toward them slowly, stopping close enough for them to feel the full weight of his presence. 2 days ago," he began, his tone steady, "you decided you could humiliate a black man, tie him to a pole, and turn him into a public spectacle. You thought there would be no consequences, that no one would care. But let me make one thing clear, you were wrong." The embarrassment on their faces was undeniable. Some of the other officers exchanged nervous glances, while others simply sat in silence, their attention locked on Jason. "This department," Jason continued, turning to address the entire room, "is a reflection of this town's culture. And as we've all seen, that culture is rotten. What happened wasn't just a disgrace to this department. It's a stain on the dignity of everyone who swore an oath to serve and protect." The silence in the room was so thick it seemed to press against every corner. Jason stepped back, his piercing gaze returning to the two officers who had caused the incident. "Do you think this is acceptable? That you can wear this uniform as a shield for your deplorable actions? Not while I'm here. Things are going to change, and that change starts now." The two men finally tried to justify themselves. We were just trying to maintain order," one of them stammered. "Order?" Jason raised his voice for the first time, his tone now full of authority. "Calling what you did maintaining order insults every officer who takes this profession seriously. There are no excuses for what happened." The interim chief, who had remained silent until then, attempted to step in. "Chief Williams, maybe we should." Jason raised his hand, cutting him off. "There is no maybe. There are no excuses, and there will be no room for racism or abuse of power in this department. If anyone has a problem with that, you can hand in your badge right now." The entire room fell silent, but the weight of Jason's words was unmistakable. He had set the tone for his leadership, and no one doubted his resolve to follow through. Even so, Jason knew this was only the first battle. Those two officers represented something much bigger, a culture that wouldn't change overnight. But he also knew that by addressing the issue head-on, he had taken the first step toward dismantling the system that kept the town stuck in its past. "I know what many of you are thinking," he said, scanning the tense faces around the room. "You're wondering who I am to come in here and say everything needs to change. Let me make it clear. I'm not here to please anyone. I'm here because this town needs justice, not performative justice, but the kind that truly serves the community." Jason then turned his attention back to the two officers at the center of the incident. "And as for you two, let's get one thing straight. You didn't just disrespect me. You dishonored the uniform you wear and the oath you took when you became police officers. You think you're untouchable because that's how it's always been here. But from now on, things are going to be different." One of the officers tried to protest. "Sir, with all due respect, it wasn't what it seemed. We were just—" "Silence," Jason interrupted, his tone carrying an authority that immediately silenced the man. "You had your chance to act with dignity, and you chose the opposite. Now, you're facing the consequences." Jason turned to the rest of the team. "And as for the rest of you, who stood by silently while all this happened, you are complicit. Silence in the face of injustice isn't neutrality. It's agreement. If you don't have the courage to confront what's wrong, then you don't belong in this department." The room remained tense, but Jason didn't lose his stride. He knew he had to press hard, but also plant the seeds of change. "I'm not here to destroy anyone," he continued. "I'm here to rebuild, to turn this department into something the town can respect, not fear. And that starts today. If you're not willing to be part of that, hand in your badge now." There were murmurs, but no one moved. Jason then turned back to the two officers. "You will be suspended and arrested immediately, and an internal investigation will be conducted. Make no mistake, this is not a symbolic gesture. It's a warning. This department will no longer be a place for abuse of power or racism. Not while I'm here." The two men lowered their heads, having nothing more to say. Jason knew this was just the beginning of the battle, but he was determined to hold his ground. The public dismissal of the two racist officers marked the starting point of significant change. The small town, long known for decades of complicit silence regarding abuses, began to breathe a different air. Jason's case not only exposed the toxicity of the local police system, but also sparked deep reflections among the residents and drew attention far beyond the town's borders. Images of Jason tied to the pole, subjected to public humiliation, quickly circulated on social media, accompanied by videos capturing the moment he confronted those responsible at the police department. The dignity with which he handled the situation, even under provocation and disdain, resonated with thousands of people who identified with the fight against structural racism and abuse of power. Civil rights organizations widely shared the case, highlighting as an example of the systemic racism that still persists in many parts of the country. "This case shows how true leadership can break cycles of abuse," one NGO wrote in a post. Jason's story quickly became a national symbol of resistance and transformation. Within the town, the response was immediate. A community meeting was organized at the local church, drawing an unusually large crowd of residents. Jason attended, dressed simply, leaving his uniform behind to connect directly with the community. During the meeting, long-hidden stories of abuse began to surface. "My brother was stopped by the police 3 times last month. He was just on his way to work," a young man said, his voice trembling with emotion. A mother, gripping the microphone with shaking hands, shared her fears. "I'm scared every day that something might happen to my children. I've always taught them to avoid the police, because you never know what might happen." Jason listened intently to every account, taking notes and absorbing the pain the residents had carried for so long. When it was his turn to speak, he stood, his voice firm yet compassionate. "I can't erase the past," he began, "but I promise you the future will be different. We're not just starting to change a police department, we're redefining how justice works in this town." He announced immediate measures, including the creation of a community oversight committee, mandatory training for all officers, and a full review of past cases involving allegations of abuse. He also emphasized the importance of collaboration with the community, making it clear that change wouldn't be imposed from the top down but built together. "I can't do this alone," Jason said, looking directly at the residents. "I need you. I need your trust, your voices, and your actions alongside mine." In the days that followed, the impact began to be felt. Reports started to emerge, many of them buried for years. Young people in the community organized to document and expose injustices, while residents who had previously been afraid began to engage more actively in conversations about change. Jason's story not only turned the town into an example of confronting racism and abuse of power, but also demonstrated that change is possible when someone is willing to lead with courage and integrity. Despite the progress, Jason knew the journey was far from over, but he was ready to keep fighting, with the community by his side. If you believe in the power of stories like this, real stories of resilience, justice, and transformation, subscribe to our channel now. Here, you'll find more inspiring stories that show how courage and determination can change lives and transform communities. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story that might change the way you see the world. And most importantly, share this story. Spread the message that racism, abuse of power, and racial discrimination have no place in our society. Together, we can be part of the change we want to see. Are you ready to be part of this transformation? Then subscribe and join us.